Ladies and gentlemen, I have presented the new book, An Accidental Brexit, at Georgetown University on September 12th. It was a real privilege, and I should like to summarize some of the key points. So the result of the British EU referendum of June 23, 2016, as you all know, was a 51.9% majority for Brexit. I would say, however, that the expected fair result in an orderly referendum would have been 52.1% for Remain, namely if the Cameron government's information brochure was 16 pages long, sent to all households in England April 9 to 11. If that would have mentioned the key finding of the Treasury study, that Brexit would mean minus 10% real income in the long run, minus 6% output decline from weaker access to the EU single market, and another minus 4% from non-realized gain from the enhanced EU single market implementation as negotiated by Mr. Cameron with the EU. The standard UK popularity function, so that is a link between output growth and popularity of government. This popularity function suggests that the inclusion of the income loss figure in the information brochure sent to all households in England and later also in the other parts of the UK, that would have brought a result of 52.1% for Remain. Now, why this information was not included, I do not know. In any case, this is very strange and unfair. Just for comparison, in the Scotland referendum, clearly the Cameron government gave the information to all the voters in Scotland that Scottish independence would mean a loss of £1,400 in income per capita. Now the Treasury study on the long-term EU benefits of the UK indicates that there would be a loss of £1,800, and this was not communicated. Also, the Treasury study, interestingly, was published a week after sending out the information brochure to households in England. Second, there has been an intensive debate about EU immigration, which Mr. Cameron portrayed as a major burden for the UK. However, the OECD has shown that immigration in the UK brings net benefits for the British budget. This has not prevented Mrs. May from repeating this point about the massive long-run immigration burden in the recent white paper on Brexit, a paper published in February 2017. And it's also strange, there is this text which says, yes, EU immigration has been a big burden for the past decade, and then they show a graph where you can see that the main phenomenon is non-EU immigration. So why is a divorce from the EU the answer to a problem one might have with non-EU immigration? The anti-immigration rhetoric of Mr. Cameron mainly served to find a scapegoat for the massive cuts in government transfers to local communities after the transatlantic banking crisis. So the total amount of cuts within 5 years was 3.5 percentage points of GDP. This is enormous. And then people in Birmingham and in many other cities would wonder, why do we have this under-provision of local services? And the answer Mr. Cameron gave before, and that was there are too many immigrants. Instead, it was the Prime Minister himself, who had created this problem of an under-provision of services. The massive deficit cuts had become necessary because the peak in the deficit GDP ratio of the UK after the banking crisis was slightly above 10%, even close to 11%, so that was way too high for the UK. But there was no fair explanation for the adjustment needs, and the scapegoat function is very strange. Now the new May government has announced that they will adopt a global Britain strategy. So that basically means they want to have more growth through a series of free trade agreements with many countries, say China, India, the US, Japan, and so on. This is certainly possible with respect to the US. Trump already has given green light for this. And it might also be possible with respect to Japan. Actually, the EU 28 at the moment is negotiating with Japan such a treaty. As regards India and China, I think one can be very skeptical. Certainly, an Indian government would ask about visa conditions for Indian workers. And obviously, in the UK, there is no broad acceptance of any kind of immigration at the moment. And as regards China, one may doubt that the US President Trump would consider this to be a good idea. And also, one should take into account that a free trade agreement with China would really mean enormous problems for British industry. The global Britain approach also will face a strange problem, a new problem, namely that there is this weakening of multilateralism, which actually comes from Washington. It's the US President Trump who is undermining the role of international organizations such as the World Trade Organization, the Bank of International Settlements, and so on. We should remember what is multilateralism. The Secretary General of the WTO, in a speech a few months ago, phrased it that way. Multilateralism means to make the small big and the big civilized. So if the World Trade Organization is seriously weakened, it will be very difficult to implement any broad global Britain approach successfully. Now the British EU referendum of 2016, I think, was really disorderly. Didn't give the right information, and certainly the Brexiteers have presented their case in a way that there will be more or less no cost to Brexit. That is certainly science fiction. Just consider the strong depreciation of the British pound, roughly 15% within a little bit more than a year, which drives up the inflation rate. In 2017 will be close to 3% instead of the anticipated 1% just a year ago. And if you have a depreciation of the currency by 15%, that also means that the share of the UK income in world income is also declining by 15%. So that means a lot of reduced leverage at the international negotiation table, and that's also a problem. There were also suggestions of the Leave groups that the UK would assume a bigger role in the Commonwealth in the future, but that is totally misleading. And Dean Acheson, the former Foreign State Secretary of the US, already, I think, raised clear doubts about any such idea in his speech at West Point in 1962. He basically said the Commonwealth is not an adequate role for the UK because the Commonwealth is relatively weak. It has no institutions, and one might add today there is no big desire on the side of Commonwealth countries to face any kind of, let's say, new leadership of the Commonwealth through the UK. It's interesting that knowledge about the EU institutions in the UK was particularly weak. Here I think one has to blame to some extent, of course, the European Commission. There's a survey by the Bertelsmann Foundations posing two very simple questions about the EU, and the respondents basically were as follows. 81% of the German respondents could correctly answer the two questions. 80% of the Italian respondents, 74% in France, 53% of the Polish respondents, and only 49% of British respondents. And the UK joined the EU in 1973, Poland 3 decades later in 2004, so that raises the question why the knowledge about Europe is so weak in the UK. It's on the other hand absolutely clear that the EU itself, the EU 27, faces very serious challenges. They should adopt broad institutional reforms, including stricter admission criteria for the Eurozone membership and a stricter implementation of national debt breaks. Plus, I think it's very important to have a higher EU budget. So far, that's just 1% of gross domestic product. And here we have a very serious problem, which was identified by Forschungsgruppe Wahlen, which is a German group of experts dealing with voting behavior. They have shown that voters, for instance, at the national election clearly understand the key political topics and fields, while at the European elections, a majority indicates that they do not understand what key policy fields are relevant at the EU level. And consequently, there is then a tendency to rather strongly favor radical parties as a means to express general dissatisfaction. And those radical parties then have won indeed in the UK and also in France the European elections in 2014. The right-wing German AfD received 7% as a startup company in 2014. And these radical parties reinvest the funds obtained then in Brussels and also the reputation gain from European elections. They reinvest this in national elections, and so the European elections become a source of political radicalization in Europe, and that of course is a very dangerous paradox and has to be changed. I think it can only be changed if the EU becomes much more visible, for instance, has a higher expenditure in Brussels, say on infrastructure, defense, maybe also the first 6 months of unemployment insurance without, I should say, youth unemployment coverage, because the youth unemployment rate in each country is largely determined by national minimum wages. Brexit also risks having a negative impact on the peace process in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement in particular, an agreement which was reached partly due to the support of the then President Bill Clinton. With a weakening of Western Europe, there clearly will be problems for the West. And in the future, I think the US will rely then more on Germany's government as a voice in Brussels. At the same time, a more Germany-dominated European Union will not find broad political support from EU 27 partners. So I think both the US and the EU should also consider seriously fields for stronger cooperation. For instance, when we think about the role of foreign direct investment in China, here we do not have a level playing field. Chinese companies can easily invest in Europe and also to a large extent in the US, while there are strong limits for the foreign direct investment of Western companies in many sectors in China. Germany and the EU 27 without the UK and traditional US support look like a new problem version of the Home Alone movies. Finally, a sentence on true lies in the Brexit campaign. On September on September 17, 2017, Sir David Norgrove, chair of the UK Statistics Authority, wrote a letter to Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson concerning the alleged £350 million in weekly contributions to the EU emphasized by the letter in his pro-Brexit campaign. And the letter of the head of the UK Statistics Authority says that Mr. Johnson confuses gross and net contributions. Of course, this is what I have also pointed out in my book. And the letter goes on, it is a clear misuse of official statistics. Now this again points to a disorderly campaign. It's also, I think, on the other hand, disappointing that the European Commission did not correct the inadequate information famously shown on this red bus. The European Commission, that is Commission President Juncker, could have sent in a blue bus to London with the correct information, which would have shown a figure less than half the amount indicated by Boris Johnson. So I am quite skeptical that the negotiations will show big progress. I think it's very unlikely that the treaties which one might wish to negotiate between London and Brussels will get a majority in March 2019 in the British Parliament. And this in the end suggests that there could be a situation when the UK government simply walks away, as they anticipate that they cannot get a majority in the Parliament. Brexit is a very important historical step for the UK and for Europe. It's a decision for this century, and it might well end with early elections, and the Brexit process might then lead to a second referendum. The result in the end could be the same or could be different, nobody really knows. But I think what one really wants in any case is one wants to have an orderly referendum with very clear information given to everybody, to all the voters in the UK.